They signed the Instrument of Surrender on the deck of USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, a gray giant moored in Tokyo Bay, surrounded by an armada that was itself the living argument of a century of industrialized warfare. Above the battleship, stair-stepped formations of American aircraft cut the sky, a measured demonstration of reach, wings, engines, and ordnance that years before had been only a distant capacity. For the Japanese officers who stood that day, some in uniform, some in the uneasy shadow of defeat, the sight was more than ceremonial. It was proof, physical and immediate, of a reality they had recognized too late. The United States could replace, rebuild, and strike at a scale Japan could not match. To understand how that moment came to pass, and what Japanese generals and admirals said about American firepower once it was too late, we must go back. We must listen to the instincts of an admiral who had seen America in peacetime and tried to translate what he had seen into strategy. We must examine a single risky gamble that produced a tactical success and strategic catastrophe. We must then watch an industrial machine awaken and roll forward, measured in ships launched, planes flown, and yards rebuilt, until attrition, logistics, and sheer numbers ground down an empire. If you like deep, source-driven military history explained clearly, subscribe and hit the bell. We'll follow the evidence closely. Long before the thunder of Pacific battles, Isoroku Yamamoto was not simply an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was, in key respects, an observer of the American nation. Young and ambitious, he had been sent to the United States in the 1920s as a naval attaché. He studied at Harvard, moved through the corridors of Detroit's automobile plants, watched steel poured in Pittsburgh, and rode through Texas oil fields. Those were not tourist stops. Yamamoto was gathering data about production methods, about society's scale, about the interdependence of raw materials, factories, transport, and manpower. When naval officers talk about observing an opponent, they mean more than counting guns. Yamamoto saw assembly lines that turned men, machines, and raw commodity into standardized interchangeable parts at speeds and scales he had not seen in Japan. He watched towns built around factories, railheads feeding mills, and the logistical choreography of moving steel and fuel across thousands of miles. He saw the infrastructure of a nation that could translate mobilization into output. It shaped him. By 1940, as Japan contemplated expansion to secure raw materials, Yamamoto voiced a bleak counsel rooted in those observations. He urged caution and realism, and assessment attributed to him, often paraphrased in subsequent histories, warned that Japan might succeed in a quick, spectacular campaign and could run wild for a few months, but a prolonged war with the United States would be beyond Japan's capacity.
That admonition was not fatalism, it was a strategic reading. He did not romanticize a quick climb to glory. He recognized a structural imbalance. Japan's industrial base was orders of magnitude smaller than America's. His advice, in essence, was to avoid entanglement with a nation whose productive muscles dwarfed Japan's. That warning would be tested almost immediately. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. For the planners and pilots who executed the operation, it was a technical and tactical triumph. Sailors and civilians in Hawaii would remember the morning as a thunderstorm of bombs and torpedoes, sudden and devastating. The Japanese strike force, the Kido Butai, had achieved surprise. Battleships and cruisers moored 10 to a berth were disabled or sunk in the shallow water of the harbor. The image of burning oil and capsized hulls burned into American memory. But the tactical measures of success did not automatically translate into strategic advantage. Pearl Harbor achieved spectacular damage to the Pacific Fleet's battleship force that day, but it failed to strike the targets that would have crippled the United States' ability to project naval and aerial power. The Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were not in port. Key ship repair facilities and dry docks that could be used to refit damaged ships were largely untouched. Fuel storage facilities and submarine pens were spared. The result was dissonant, a painful, galvanizing blow to American pride and security, but not a wound deep enough to stop the United States from fighting on, reconstituting, and multiplying its forces. Yamamoto had warned his colleagues about the danger of a war of attrition with the United States. Observers in Tokyo might have been tempted to regard Pearl Harbor as validation of a bold strategy that would cow the Americans into a negotiated settlement. Instead, the attack unified American opinion, extinguished isolationist sentiment, and triggered an industrial and military mobilization whose pace few in Tokyo had internalized. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japan did indeed move aggressively. Anchored by initial victories, Japanese forces swept through the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Netherlands, East Indies, and the Solomon Islands among them. Within a matter of months, the Japanese empire expanded its reach and captured resources, oil, rubber, and raw materials considered vital for sustaining the wartime economy. Those gains could be pointed to as evidence of a successful strategic design, especially in the short term. In operational terms, Japan achieved feats of coordination and reach that belied its size. Yet Yamamoto's calendar, the 6 months he had warned about, began to tick. Rapid territorial expansion could not change the arithmetic Yamamoto had observed in Detroit and Pittsburgh.
Japanese industry could not match the United States' capacity to produce ships, airplanes, munitions, and the logistical tail that supported sustained, simultaneous operations across an ocean-spanning theater. The question was not only the raw number of ships and airplanes. It was the ability to train replacement crews, to keep factories running through sustained bombardment, to transport supplies across thousands of miles of ocean, and to repair and return damaged units to service. Those were the metrics that would erode initial Japanese advantages. The turning point came predictably and decisively where naval power, the centerpiece of Japan's early success, found itself vulnerable to both intelligence and industrial muscle. Midway Atoll in early June 1942 became the theater where decisions, chance, and the limits of production collided. The sequence that led to Midway's decisive clash was not a single grand plan unfolding in one direction. It was the product of code-breaking, of audacious risk-taking, and of a series of choices by commanders on both sides under pressure. In Washington, teams at Station Hypo, led by figures like Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been breaking elements of Japanese naval communications. Code-breaking did not deliver certainty. It offered probabilities, cross-checks, and the ability to anticipate Japanese intentions at critical moments. It allowed American planners to prepare a trap rather than react blindly. On the Japanese side, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier striking force, the same admiral who had overseen the Pearl Harbor strike. His task at Midway was to draw out and destroy the American carrier force, eliminate Midway as a U.S. forward base, and secure a strategic position from which Japan could threaten Hawaii. The operational plan involved complexity, carriers operating with cruisers, destroyers, scouting planes, and a delicate timetable for launching and recovering aircraft. It counted on Japanese tactical superiority in the carrier air arm, particularly the long-range capabilities of their torpedo bombers and the formidable performance of their naval aviators. But the Japanese plan, like all plans, met friction. It relied on surprise, synchronized reconnaissance, and precise timing. It also relied on a culture of decision-making that, for better or worse, left critical choices in the hands of a small number of admirals who had to interpret fragmentary information under stress. Nagumo's dilemma at Midway would be the sort of choice that crystallizes the difference between tactical acumen and strategic adaptability. At sea, the physical conditions were unforgiving. The carrier decks were crowded with aircraft, each mission depending on the precise rotation of launch and recovery cycles. Fuel and munitions for air operations were not limitless, and the chemistry of readiness mattered.
When initial Japanese search patrols failed to report precise target locations, or when reports were contradictory, Nagumo faced the question of whether to rearm his planes for a different type of attack or to keep them configured for the mission at hand. Each option carried its own risk. For the Americans, the picture was different but no less fraught. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had fewer carriers than the Japanese fleet, but crucial intelligence and a willingness to accept risk. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding the air groups from USS Enterprise, flew into a search pattern that would prove decisive. The Americans also benefited from a crucial operational fact. Earlier damage to USS Yorktown at the Battle of the Coral Sea had been partially repaired at Pearl Harbor and at sea, and that damaged carrier's survival meant a marginal parity of forces at Midway that would not have existed if Yorktown had been lost. When the two fleets finally closed, a series of small, violent moments would determine the battlefield. Dive bomber squadrons, torpedo planes, and fighter escorts intersected in the air above the atoll. Broken communications, delayed launches, and the sheer chaos of aerial combat created openings. Japanese combat air patrols, stretched between protecting the carriers and engaging enemy formations, sometimes failed to intercept incoming dive bombers before they found their targets. In the torrent of decisions and counter-decisions, a single successful strike on a concentrated carrier deck could set off a chain reaction of fires and explosions that no dry dock and no shipyard could quickly remedy in the middle of a campaign. Midway crystallized the limits Yamamoto had feared.
The carriers, the most expensive and strategically decisive assets in the Pacific, were not immune to sudden losses. Each carrier represented not just metal and armor, but a trained air group, the pilots and deck crews whose experience could not be produced overnight. Japan's pool of experienced carrier aviators, while formidable early in the war, was finite. The United States, through a combination of production and attrition management, could regenerate air groups faster than Japan could replace veteran crews. But Midway did not happen solely because of production tables. It happened because of choices made under uncertainty, intelligence exploited, lines of communication misread, and the compounding effects of tactical losses. For Japan, the loss of carriers and veteran air crews in the space of a few hours was not only a material blow, it was a strategic rupture. Even before the battle commenced, there were signs of how the larger contest would be decided. American repair yards and industrial complexes, yards in the Pacific Northwest, California, and the Northeast, were already working at volumes Japan could not match. Shipbuilding techniques that emphasized modular construction and standardized components sped production.
By mid-1942, the United States had shifted from peacetime patterns to a wartime tempo, in which shipways and airplane factories ran day and night. The American capacity to produce escort carriers and fleet carriers, to churn out replacement aircraft, and to train replacement crews in numbers Japan could not match, created a structural advantage that would reveal itself at sea and on the islands. This imbalance, structural and cumulative, did not immediately become a political confession in Tokyo. It appeared instead in conversations among officers, in quiet post-battle assessments, in the rueful tone of commanders who watched their most skilled pilots fall and realized they could not be replaced, and in the growing sense that the initial dazzling arc of conquest would eventually meet the immovable fact of industrial output. Yamamoto had not been the only Japanese officer to predict friction between tactical success and strategic overreach, but his analysis carried a particular weight because it came from someone who had seen the American system with his own eyes. It was more than prudent counsel. It was a diagnosis of capacity. Yet in Tokyo, urgency, ambition, and political dynamics pushed decisions forward in ways that undercut that diagnosis. The Navy and Army did not always coordinate aims, and the political leadership, wrapped in imperial prerogatives and national momentum, often viewed boldness as a virtue rather than a risk factor. As spring became summer in 1942, the arc Yamamoto had foreseen neared its fulcrum point. The initial Japanese momentum in the Pacific met a resolute, regenerating American response. Midway, when it came, would be a violent expression of that collision, a place where codebreakers and pilots, repair yards and admirals, experience and numbers would meet in compressed form. The battle would not only tilt tactical balance, it would change strategic logic. Yet it was not simply a single battle that decided the war. Midway would be the fulcrum, but the lever of American industrial power, the ability to replace, to innovate, and to sustain, would press the war in ways that battlefield heroism alone could not alter. Carriers could be rebuilt, ships could be launched, and factories could be expanded. The damage of a single defeat could be absorbed if the national economy could muster replacements at scale. In Tokyo, the reports coming back from frontline commanders began to carry a new tone, a mixture of admiration for bravery and a sober accounting of loss. The Japanese High Command confronted a reality that officers like Yamamoto had warned about in quieter meetings and private assessments. Tactical ingenuity and early victories had secured grand expanses, but they had also extended lines of supply and demanded a resilience that Japan's industrial base could not provide indefinitely. This was not merely a numerical problem, it was a human one.
The experience required to launch and recover carrier aircraft under combat conditions was learned in months of hard operations. Pilots were not interchangeable cogs. Shipyard workers, too, required training and a labor supply. Fuel shortages, ship repair backlogs, and the attrition of personnel all accumulated. To put the scale in perspective, consider how different the production tempos were on either side of the Pacific. The United States, galvanized by attack and operating within a continental economy with vast reserves of raw materials,
could convert peacetime factories into wartime production lines. Michigan's plants became aircraft factories. The Midwest steel mills fed shipyards. If a carrier deck was gutted by bombs, a new ship could be laid down in yards that had learned an assembly line cadence and workforce deployment plans. Japan's shipyards and resource bases, by contrast, were dispersed and fragile, subject to supply constraints and the interruptions of Allied interdiction. But raw capacity alone would not have clinched victory without operational learning. The Americans learned, sometimes painfully, how to use their resources more effectively. Carrier task forces began to operate with combined arms in a manner that leveraged industrial depth: fighters to escort, dive bombers to strike, escort vessels to protect convoys that sustained far-flung operations. Logistics became a decisive weapon, as the ability to move men and material across the Pacific multiplied the combat effectiveness of individual platforms. These processes, the unfolding of industrial advantage into operational dominance, unfolded over months, not days. Wisdom, as Yamamoto experienced it, was slow and forensic. The Japanese commanders who later spoke about the war's arc did so with the accumulated weight of observation and loss. Many spoke candidly in post-war interrogations about the miscalculations and the mismatch that only became visible when it was too late to change course. But before the post-war reflections, before the judgments of historians, there were the immediate consequences of choices made in the thin air over the Pacific. A skipper's decision to launch, a radio operator's misread signal, a wing commander's split-second turn. Those human moments aggregated into strategic outcomes. In the next decisive series of hours, a handful of dive bombers would find the exposed decks of carriers, and the calamity that followed would render Yamamoto's calendar terrifyingly accurate. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the stage was set. Across hundreds of miles of ocean, apparatuses of reading and reacting were in motion. Radios hissed with partial reports. Search aircraft scanned the horizon. On both sides, men checked fuel gauges, folded maps, and tightened harnesses. Commanders weighed risks they could not fully see. Then, in a matter of minutes that compressed months of strategic calculation into sudden action, the sky opened with ordnance and flame.
In a matter of minutes, the sky over Midway became the crucible in which months of strategy, production, and human courage would either converge or unravel. Torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, plunged toward flak and fighters. They drew the combat air patrol down into low, desperate fights. That diversion, catastrophic for the torpedo squadrons, created an opening above the carrier decks, an opening filled in a near miracle of timing by American dive bombers sighting the targets at the precise moment the Japanese carriers' decks were full of fuel and ordnance. The sequence looks, in cold hindsight, almost inevitable. In real time, it was a chaotic calculus of chance and choice. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were hit almost simultaneously. Flames raced across flight decks, explosions punched through hangars, and the trained crews who had once launched wave after wave over Pearl Harbor found themselves fighting to save the very platforms that made their early victories possible. Hours later, Hiryu, which initially escaped, was struck by a coordinated American counterattack and disabled. 4 fleet carriers, Japan's most precious offensive instruments, were gone or fatally damaged in a single swing. The United States paid for its victory. USS Yorktown, patched up hurriedly after Coral Sea damage, was struck by torpedoes and later scuttled. Lives were lost on both sides. Yet the strategic calculus had shifted. Japan had lost not only ships but the veteran air crews and maintenance cadres that gave its early carrier force qualitative superiority. Those were not things that could be replaced by steel alone. Experience, like the men who embodied it, was slow to regenerate. Post-war interrogations and after-action reports, both American and Japanese, describe Midway as the fulcrum moment. In interviews recorded by the U.S. Navy and summarized by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and other post-war inquiries, Japanese officers later framed Midway as the point where the balance began to tilt inexorably. They spoke with sorrow or resignation of the loss of trained men and of options that had narrowed after that day. Yamamoto's 6-month calendar, which had begun as a warning, now read like a measurement. From Midway onward, the war in the Pacific assumed a new character. The initiative that Japan had seized in late 1941 and early 1942 met a steadily increasing American material pressure. Shipyards that had been retooled, plants that had been repurposed, and training pipelines that had been expanded began to produce at tempos Japan could not match. The American industrial surge was not a single spectacular number, but an aggregate of many changes. More assembly line yards, more standardized parts, more factories kept running by a civilian mobilization the scale of which must be pictured to be understood. Consider for a moment how that manufactured edge translated into operations.
Where once a single fleet carrier could create decisive force, by 1943-44 it had become possible for the United States to deploy multiple carrier task forces that replenished losses more quickly and operated in concert with ever-growing logistical tails. Escort carriers, smaller and quicker to build, freed fleet carriers for offensive operations. Airframe production soared, fighter and bomber models evolved rapidly. Training programs shifted focus from quantity alone to the logistics of replacement, how to turn recruits into pilots, how to cycle squadrons from frontline experience to rest, and how to preserve institutional knowledge even as losses occurred. On the other side, Japan's difficulties compounded. Its industrial geography, scattered, resource-constrained, reliant on imported raw materials secured in the early conquests, could not sustain a multi-year, high-intensity war against a continental industrial power. Japanese yards lacked the scale and redundancy of American shipbuilding centers. Attrition of trained aviators, petty officers, and specialized technicians mattered as much as the loss of hulls. Fuel became a narrowing bottleneck. Repair facilities were vulnerable to air attack and blockade. The arc Yamamoto had traced, swift victorious expansion followed by a grinding attritional decline, played out in theaters small and large across the Pacific. Guadalcanal became the first bloody demonstration. What began as a campaign for control of an airfield quickly turned into months of grinding combat across jungle, coral, and logging trails. Henderson Field, once secured by Marines and Army Air Force's pilots, became a toehold for projecting power and, simultaneously, a prize that Japan could neither safely retake nor fully neutralize. The sea lanes around the Solomon Islands, Iron Bottom Sound among them, became grim registers of attrition. Destroyer runs, popularly labeled the Tokyo Express, tried to keep isolated garrisons fed and reinforced under cover of night, but American air and naval interdiction increasingly strangled those deliveries. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal faced dwindling rations, disease, and the inability to evacuate the wounded or to rotate exhausted units. The island's campaign stretched Japanese logistics thinner and introduced a new template. American industrial weight, combined with improving joint operations and logistics, could convert tactical local gains into strategic squeezes. As the months unfolded, what had once been audacity and reach increasingly taxed Japan's capacity to pay the maintenance bill of its empire. The Marianas Campaign in 1944, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, exposed another layer of industrial consequence. Taking Saipan in particular was an operational necessity for the Japanese. Its loss opened the homeland to sustain strategic bombing.
For the Americans, seizing the Marianas allowed B-29 superfortresses to operate within range of Japan, transforming distant industrial capacity into direct assault on the Japanese home islands. The human and material cost was immense on both sides, but the result was to move the war's center of gravity ever closer to Japan's factories and cities. Logistics, again, were decisive. Supplying a garrison on Saipan required fuel, ammunition, food, and trained replacements sent across contested seas. American escorts, blockade strategy, and interdiction all meant that the steady American flow of replacements and supplies could sustain campaigns whose operational demands exhausted Japanese capacity. In post-war debriefings, Japanese commanders who survived Saipan and the Marianas described an increasing awareness that the war could not be prolonged without catastrophic attrition. They spoke in the reflective tone common to those interrogations of hopes and calculations that had once seemed plausible, but now revealed their limits. By late 1944, the fighting reached the Philippines and Leyte Gulf, a titanic engagement that signaled the waning surface power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The battle itself, fought in multiple actions over 3 days, saw Japan throw nearly everything it had left into an attempt to disrupt the American landings, birthed in part from a recognition that retaking the Philippines might delay the U.S. advance toward Japan. The result was brutal. The Japanese fleet suffered losses that left it skeletal in capital ships and exposed in sustainment capacity. In many quarters of the Japanese officer corps, the impression hardened that the sea lanes were slipping beyond rescue. As material shortages tightened, desperate tactical adaptations followed. Kamikaze attacks, organized suicidal strikes by aircraft laden with explosives directed against Allied ships, emerged as a stark manifestation of constrained choice. From the Japanese perspective, discussed in post-war statements and interrogations, kamikaze were not an expression of strength, but an acknowledgement of diminishing alternatives. When pilots and planes could not deliver strategic parity through conventional operations, massed sacrificial attacks became a tactic of hope to inflict disproportionate damage. For the Americans, kamikaze inflicted significant loss of life and ship damage, particularly in the Philippines and at Okinawa.
Yet even here, the structural advantage persisted. Damaged ships could be repaired or replaced. Crews and material losses, while painful, did not shift the overall production balance. Okinawa in spring 1945 magnified the human cost of that imbalance. The island's capture required massive amphibious assaults and months of bitter fighting, culminating in one of the bloodiest confrontations of the Pacific War.
The battle produced enormous casualties among soldiers and civilians alike and showcased kamikaze's lethal potential as hundreds of suicide sorties targeted the invasion fleet and support vessels. The operation provided the United States with a base from which an invasion of the home islands might have launched and further tightened Japan's ability to sustain its defenses. Throughout these campaigns, American factories continued to crank out materiel. Some metrics help to illustrate the scale without pretending to exhaust the story. Liberty ships, the ubiquitous cargo vessels that kept men and supplies moving, were produced in huge numbers, over 2,000 of them, by an industrial network that had learned to cut construction time from months to weeks at peak efficiency. Aircraft production reached tens of thousands annually by the middle and later years of the war, and the program of escort carriers and the Essex-class fleet carriers ramped up so that by the mid-war years, new carriers could be brought into service at a pace Japan's yards could not match. These are not mere tallies. They are the material facts that reporters in Tokyo and officers in the field would reference later when admitting, with varying degrees of bitterness or resignation, that the United States had the staying power Japan lacked. Pilots and planes deserve particular attention in this assessment. Japan's early war naval aviators were superb, highly trained, aggressive, and benefiting from doctrine that emphasized maneuver and marksmanship. Their primary fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M-0, dominated early clashes due to its range and maneuverability. But as the conflict lengthened, American design philosophy shifted. Aircraft like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair prioritized speed, firepower, ruggedness, and pilot survivability. They could absorb damage that earlier designs could not. They could be produced in quantity, and they could be flown by rapidly trained replacements whose aggregate effectiveness, backed by material and doctrinal support, outstripped the dwindling pool of Japanese veterans. Training pipelines favored the United States in ways that became decisive. The American system could cycle pilots through replacement training units, provide incremental experience, and keep the supply chain of trained aircrew moving. Japan, faced with losses of veterans and constraints on fuel for training flights and on raw materials for aircraft production, could not match that churn. Post-war interrogations of Japanese aviators and officers recorded a recurring theme. The early edge in qualitative skill could not outlast the quantitative advantage that came with a continental-scale industrial mobilization. In parallel, American innovation in combined arms and logistics made each unit more potent.
Improved radar, better carrier operations coordination, anti-submarine advances, and refined tactics for supporting amphibious landings all leveraged production numbers into operational effect. American doctrine increasingly treated logistics as a strategic weapon, not merely a support function. Securing ports, building advanced bases, and maintaining continuous flow of supplies became central to campaigns that consumed thousands of tons of materiel and required a steady stream of replacement personnel. This industrial and operational transformation intersected with strategic bombing in a way that, for many observers in Tokyo and among U.S. analysts afterward, crystallized the imbalance of modern war. Beginning in late 1944 and accelerating into 1945, B-29 superfortresses based in the Marianas carried out sustained attacks on Japan's home islands. Those raids evolved from precision attempts to incendiary strategies that targeted urban industrial complexes and the wooden, densely packed residential areas that both concentrated civilian populations and housed cottage industries critical to the war effort. The March 1945 Tokyo raid, for instance, produced a firestorm of a scale that devastated whole districts of the capital. The morality and ethics of strategic bombing, the civilian cost, and the debate over efficacy are beyond the scope of pure operational analysis, but when Japanese officers later faced American interrogators, they often spoke of the psychological and material effect of these raids: disrupted production, shattered transport networks, and a populace exhausted by relentless destruction. Those testimonies, collected by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and in ad hoc post-surrender interviews, consistently argued that strategic bombing had reduced Japan's ability to produce and distribute war material, undermining both military and civilian resilience. The arrival of nuclear weapons as an instrument of war introduced a shock no industrial table had prepared for.
Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later produced instantaneous, unimaginable devastation and, perhaps equally important from the Japanese leadership's perspective, announced a new threshold of destructive capacity that conventional military thinking struggled to incorporate. Historians continue to debate causality and the weight each factor carried, but in internal Japanese records and in reconstructed accounts of high-level deliberations, the combination of atomic destruction, continued strategic bombing, and the Soviet Union's entry into the war on August 8 pressed the leadership into a crisis of calculation. Emperor Hirohito's intervention, conveyed through the imperial rescript to the nation, made surrender explicit. For many Japanese officers and commanders who had once defended the expansionist strategy with conviction, the aftermath was a time for hard questions.
In post-war interrogations and memoirs, recurring themes surfaced: misreadings of American resolve, underestimation of industrial scaling, and the tragic reality that some warnings, most notably Yamamoto's, had been insufficiently heeded. Yamamoto's voice, in fact, had been taken from the living debate in April 1943, when his aircraft was intercepted and shot down in an ambush planned by American Signals Intelligence, an operation known to the Allies as Operation Vengeance. His death removed one of the most candid strategic thinkers in the Imperial Navy, an officer who had combined frontline competence with first-hand observation of American industrial society. In later accounts by Japanese officers, commentators and historians often note that Yamamoto's absence mattered because he had been one of the few in Tokyo prepared to articulate the structural constraints that govern Japan's strategic options. Other commanders left frank appraisals. Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the first wave over Pearl Harbor, survived the war and made post-war statements reflecting on the nature of the conflict. In interviews, he suggested that Pearl Harbor had been a tactical triumph that carried unintended strategic consequences, principally the unification of American public opinion and the mobilization that followed. These reflections, when recorded by American and Japanese sources after the war, are typically paraphrased rather than verbatim unless explicitly cited from a primary transcript. Similarly, various Japanese naval and army officers, some during interrogations for the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, others in memoirs, acknowledged that Japan had misread American industrial capacity and that some strategic decisions had been driven as much by political imperatives and honor considerations as by clear-eyed operational analysis. It is crucial to stress nuance here. Japanese leaders were not uniform in blame or analysis. Some argued that Japan could have prolonged the conflict further through different strategic allocations. Others contended that defeat was inevitable once the Allies had marshaled a global industrial coalition. Many officers cited specific constraints, fuel shortages, loss of merchant tonnage to submarine warfare, and the depletion of skilled personnel as the proximate mechanisms by which American firepower translated into defeat. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, in its exhaustive post-war study, concluded that strategic bombing and the submarine blockade had severely impaired Japan's war-making capacity. Japanese testimony to investigators often corroborated that judgment in varying ways. What then did Japanese generals and admirals say about American firepower after it was too late? The answers were neither monolithic nor melodramatic. They tended toward a few convergent themes: recognition of an industrial scale they had underestimated, sorrow over the loss of irreplaceable human capital, experienced air crews, veteran petty officers, and skilled technicians, and an admission, sometimes expressed bitterly, that early tactical successes had carried heavy strategic costs. Many Japanese officers reflected that a different set of political choices early in the war might have altered the trajectory. Some suggested that avoiding a continental clash with the United States, securing resources but limiting direct provocation, could have preserved bargaining space. Others argued that improved coordination between Army and Navy and more realistic assessments of supply lines might have prolonged effective resistance. These are counterfactuals raised after the fact, often as intellectual exercises, but they underscore a central truth. Military efficacy in the 20th century could not be separated from industrial logistics and political decision-making. Yamamoto had tried to translate that truth into counsel. The empire chose an alternate path, whose costs became manifest in time. When historians and veterans alike talk about those post-war admissions, they do so with mixed emotions. For some Japanese officers, acknowledgement of American capacity came as a reluctant tribute to an adversary's industry and endurance. For others, it was a condemnation of the domestic political dynamics, militarist zeal, factionalism, and a culture that sometimes valued boldness and honor over the patient calculus of attrition. In the debriefings recorded by Allied interrogators, a recurring sentiment was that Japan's leaders had not fully internalized the scale of industrial mobilization the United States could bring to bear. It was as if the early dazzling victories had obscured the arithmetic that mattered most in a protracted conflict. The human dimension of these admissions should not be lost. When officers spoke of firepower, they often did so with reference to soldiers and civilians suffering, cities incinerated by incendiary raids, sailors killed by kamikaze strikes, young pilots sent on one-way missions. The sobering reality was that industrial output, once unleashed, translated into weapons and logistics that multiplied human loss on an unprecedented scale. Japanese testimonies reflected this double awareness: tactical respects for the enemy's skill and a painful reckoning with the mechanisms of mass destruction that modern industry enabled. Returning to the image that opened this account, the Japanese delegation on the deck of USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the scene encapsulates the arc of recognition and regret. Those officers who had once planned, fought, and commanded stood before a fleet that represented the very capabilities Yamamoto had seen in Detroit and Pittsburgh years before the war.
The Armada and the overhead squadrons were not merely symbols of American victory. They were the manifest outcome of industrial decisions and strategic investments that, once activated, could not easily be reversed. What was said by Japanese generals in the aftermath, what they admitted to Allied interrogators, recorded in memoirs, and expressed in private correspondence, amounts to a repeated theme. The mismatch between a continental power's industrial reserve and an island empire's constrained resources was decisive. They noted that tactical brilliance could achieve surprise, seize territory, and win battles, but that it could not, by itself, bridge structural deficits in production, logistics, and manpower. That was the crux of Yamamoto's warning, and mid- and post-war testimony suggests that officers came to regard it as an accurate strategic diagnosis. There is a final layer to this narrative worth considering: expertise ignored. Yamamoto's forecast was fundamentally an appeal to prudence based on observation. To the degree that it was disregarded, through the appetite for bold action, the allure of rapid gains, or the political calculations of the moment, the tragedy that followed became less an accident of fate than an outcome of avoidable choice. That does not simplify responsibility into single actors. The final decisions were made in a complex environment of imperial ambition, bureaucratic division, and cultural expectations about honor and sacrifice. Still, the fact that a senior naval officer had, years before, cautioned against a prolonged attrition war with America is central to the title's question. The warnings were there. They were articulated by those who understood the enemy. They were heard, but not heeded in time to change course. For modern students of strategy, the lessons are plain but uncomfortable. Industrial capacity is not an abstract economic fact. It is a form of national power that, once mobilized, transforms tactical events into strategic outcomes. Expertise that recognizes such realities may be uncomfortable to political leaders seeking quick success. War magnifies the effects of coordination or the lack of it, and the human price of miscalculation is measured not merely in lost territory or sunk ships, but in the lives of soldiers and civilians caught behind supply lines or under incendiary skies. So, what did Japanese generals say after it was too late? They said in different words and tones that the United States possessed a scale of industrial and logistical power that Japan, even at its proudest moment of expansion, could not match indefinitely. They reflected on lost opportunities to mitigate that mismatch and on the unbearable human cost that followed.
Their words in post-war interrogations, memoirs, and recorded testimonies serve not only as confession, but as a cautionary record. In modern war, the capacity to replace matters as much as the skill to strike. The ability to sustain transforms short-term victories into long-term possibilities. The surrender on USS Missouri made that lesson visible in steel and canvas, in flags and signatures. It was a somber confirmation of a strategic truth that Yamamoto had tried to teach, and that, in the end, the nation discovered the hard way. As we study those testimonies and those battles, the imperative is not nostalgia for battlefield heroism, nor a reductionist triumphalism about victory. It is the sober requirement to remember how modern war takes shape, how industrial choices become instruments of policy, and how expert counsel, if ignored, can lead to outcomes that are catastrophic not only for military institutions, but for humanity itself. If this deep dive helped you see the Pacific War with a different clarity, like and share this video, and tell us in the comments which battle or strategic question you'd like us to examine next.